to interact with young minds and help them find their way, find their own voice, their own self. After all, that's what research is about. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about certain basic tools of research. And when I mean research, I'm talking largely of the area of comparative studies or literary studies. But whatever area you may be working with, the question of translation and question of cross-cultural interaction is invariably going to crop up at some period of time. So one of the exciting fields that has come up from past 3 or 4 decades is translation studies, and more recently is the idea of world literature that has gained in prominence from 90s onwards. And I'm sure this will be of some help. My talk today will be of some help because I'm personally working on these areas. So I'm a researcher. So it's not that you are students and I'm teacher. We are all in the same boat, but some people are sitting in different places. That's about all. So what I will be doing is I will be talking about comparative literature, but more specific research tools in or more specific aspects of comparative literature. And those aspects are translation studies and world literature. These are the 2 emergent disciplines that have captured our attention. And as Indians, we are born translators. We translate every moment. When we go to canteen, we talk in 4 languages. Code switching is something that comes naturally to us, and we are not even aware of it. Means multilingualism is a way of life rather than a political program for Indians. So keeping all that in mind, I will be talking about some of the key ideas of translation studies and comparative literature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start presenting my screen, and I will be happy to have your questions, and I will be happy to give my inputs regarding specific queries that you have. So what I'm going to do is let me start share screen. Yeah. So let me see if I'm visible. Am I visible to all of you? And is the slide visible?
Yes, your screen is visible. Yeah.
Right. So this is the topic that I'm going to talk about, and translation studies as world literature and world literature as translation studies is the topic that I will be talking about. And what am I going to do here is that I will be building an argument. The argument is that certain conceptual and methodological formulations of world literature after 1990s, especially by scholars like David Damrosch and others, display strong continuities with earlier development in translation studies, especially the ideas of refraction, ideas of descriptive translation studies, and so on and so forth. There are strong continuities between these 2 seemingly different fields of comparative literature and of translation studies and world literature. By building this argument, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce to students and researchers to recent developments and debates in translation studies and world literature, and also explore common grounds and differences between the 2 disciplines. So this talk that I will be giving will introduce you to more updated ways of studying translation and more updated, more recent ways of studying world literature, and also we'll look at relation between the 2 disciplines. And if you are feeling that I don't know much about world literature right now, then it's completely fine. I will be talking about what it is, though all of you are familiar with translation, I'm sure. And how I'm going to do it, right? This was what I was going to do. Now, how I'm going to do it? Because most of our talk is going to be theoretical, I'm going to ground myself into very important translations and 2 texts of world literature One is John Ruskin's Unto This Last, which was translated into Gujarati by somebody called M.K. Gandhi, whom I should not talk about much. Everybody knows who he is. And V.D. Savarkar's Indian War of Independence, 1857, which was written in Marathi, but it was translated into English and many other languages of world literature by 1909. So these are the two books in translation and two books of world literature that I'm going to be talking about to make my arguments very specific. So that will also help you to grasp more abstract, more conceptual argument that we are making. And in the process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how conventional views of translation, which are embedded in our education system, our thinking about translation in India largely, are inadequate to understand the significance of these two translations. Which means that in order to update ourselves, we need to unlearn something. It is something like accent reduction. So if you are trying to speak with American accent, then one thing that you have to do is to reduce Gujarati accent, right? It is called accent reduction. So in order to update ourselves, we have to unlearn whatever we already know about translation in order to look at these newer approaches to translation. And then from traditional conventional translation studies, I will talk about contemporary translation studies. And from contemporary traditional views of world literature, from the time of Goethe onwards, to more recent approaches to the idea of world literature that you find in Durizin, Damrosch, and Moretti. And obviously, we'll also try to figure out what is the connection between translation and world literature. So let's take a look at this book. It's a well-known book, but it's not getting the attention that it deserves in literary studies, especially in English studies, from translation and comparative perspective. So this is a book called Sarvodaya, which is Ruskin Unto This Last Na Adhare. And there is a small history of this book that we are familiar with. In 1907, somewhere between 8 to 25 June, while traveling from Johannesburg to Durban, the young lawyer called M.K. Gandhi read a book called Unto This Last, which was written in 1860 by a very famous British art critic, theorist, scholar called John Ruskin. Gandhi says that I could not sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance to the ideals of this book. And when Gandhi changed his life to the ideas in the book, you know what happened. The rest, they say, is history, right? Even in his autobiography, he says that talks about magic spell of a book. And he says that this book, Unto This Last, brought about instantaneous and practical transformation in my life. This was because he discovered some of my deepest convictions, his own pre-existing convictions reflected in this great book. And this is what it is. He summarized the book as follows, right? And these are the three principles that that the good of the individual is contained in good of all. You cannot have good things for yourself, or your good future does not lie only in your personal individual future, but good future for all. The second revolutionary idea here is that lawyers' work has the same value as the barbers, in as much as all have the same right of earning their livelihood from their work. And the third idea is that a life of labor, life of tiller of the soil, and life of handicraftsman is the life worth living. Now, these are the three cornerstones of Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian political struggle that we are aware of. He summarized this Unto This Last in Gujarati, and he called it Sarvodaya, that is welfare of all. Published in 9 installments in Indian Opinion from May to July 1908, almost 102 years ago. And the book was translated later on into English by Walji Govindji Desai in 1956, in which Ruskin's winged words were being retained as far as possible. So what you see is there is an English book translated into Gujarati, and now it is retranslated back into English, which is a strange phenomenon, right? So this movement of a text from English to Gujarati and from Gujarati back to English is what we understand as circulation of text, right? And its profound impact on Indian freedom struggle through translation reveals translation as one of the key mechanisms of world literature. So you can see that translation here has a profound influence on freedom struggle, nothing less than that. Here is another book that we can look at. It's by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, one of the leading freedom fighters of the times, and his ideology is a kind of polar opposite of Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian political theory and Gandhian practice of politics. It's opposite of that, right? And on the other end of political spectrum. And he wrote a book called 1857 Swatantra Samar, translated as Indian War of Independence in 1857. During his stay in London as a student of law, in which he countered colonial interpretation of the mutiny of 1857 from a revolutionary nationalist perspective. The book obviously was written in Marathi. Savarkar and his associates in India House, London, managed to smuggle this Marathi manuscript out of London, and they tried to publish it in Maharashtra. But the British Secret Service raided the press and the book went back to its author. So unique case where book is banned even before it is published, right? Even before it is printed, the book is banned. So book went back to author in England. Then the whole members of the India House, a group called Abhinav Bharat, started by Shyamji Krishna Verma, as many of you may be familiar with Shyamji Krishna Verma's contribution. They tried to publish it in Paris and later at Germany, where they thought they would have Devanagari fonts, right? They thought in Germany they would have Devanagari fonts because in Germany they had many Sanskrit books that were printed. But the government of Germany and Paris did not want to offend British, and so they refused to publish the book in Marathi in Germany and in Paris. So another track that was taken, that book was translated into English by the members of Abhinav Bharat Society, the secret society, and the people were Koregaonkar, Phadke and Kunte under the supervision of VVS Iyer. The English translation was sent to Holland and was published from there in 1907. And rumors were spread by the revolutionaries that the book was being printed in France. So here is a book that was supposed to be published in France, but it was actually sent to Holland. So British government could not locate where the publisher was. The British government in India banned the book even before it was published. The revolutionaries struggled the book into India, the English translation, by wrapping the book in covers, printed bogus names as Posthumous Paper of Pickwick Club or Scott's Work or Don Quixote. The later editions of the book were secretly published by freedom fighters like Madame Bhikaji Kama in France, Gadar Party in USA, and Rash Bihari Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose in Japan. The book was officially published in India in English and Marathi only after 1947. So you can look at this history, very fascinating history of this book and translation. And why am I discussing this? What has that got to do with translation studies? Then let us take a look at how people generally think about translation in India, especially researchers who just start thinking about translation. And these are some of the traditional ways of looking at translation. And you might have heard of these ideas. This is the traditional, conventional thinking about translation. Translation is like translation is what is lost in translation. Poetry is what is lost in translation is a very famous idea that was promoted by many people, especially Robert Frost. He's trying to define what is poetry. Translation is like woman. If she is beautiful, she is not faithful, and if she is faithful, she is not beautiful. This is a very sexist, patriarchal idea about both women and translation, right? But this is fairly widespread, and feminists have questioned these ideas very categorically. Translation always involves loss, and it always approximates. So there is nothing like exact translation is one of the conventional, traditional thinking about translation. Never translate word for word, never translate literally. Translation should be faithful to the spirit rather than to the letter of the original. All this conventional thinking about translation is older than the Roman thinkers like Cicero or Horace. So this conventional, traditional thinking about translation as a loss, right? Translation as not never being exact. Translation is always a failure, or translation is always approximate. All these ideas are conventional ways of thinking about translation. So if you look at, say for example, if you look at these established ideas deeply, then they are dualistic, normative, and hierarchic. That is, they compare translation with the original, which only a person who knows the first language can do it, right? So only a person who knows Gujarati can evaluate whether translation of Narsi Mehta into English is inferior or exact or bad or good. Translation obviously appears to be inferior and secondary compared to the original, which is the act of genius. And translation is considered from point of view of the source text and language, and primary focus on how to translate, the practice of translating. So these are very traditional views of translation. A break from these views and a new way of thinking about translation emerged very late. It emerged in late 70s with scholars like James Holmes, and they built the basis of the discipline called translation studies in 1978. And this discipline concerns itself with the problems raised by the production and description of translations. So why did we discuss all this? Now, if we look at the two books that we discussed, one is Sarvodaya and second is 1857 Swatantra Samar, or Indian War of Independence. Then if you compare, say for example, English by Ruskin with Gujarati version by Gandhi, and try to find out whether unto this last title and Sarvodaya is a good translation. Is it an exact translation? Is there any loss? Is there any merit in translation? You are trying to evaluate. So our way of conventional way of looking at these two translations would be normative, right? By normative, I mean evaluating. Means whether translation is good or bad, what is lost in translation. But what happens is that we fail to take into account the history of this text and translation as a practice. What did translation do at that time, right? What was the impact of translated text on culture? What was the ideological, what was the historical agenda behind translation is also something that is lost. We don't take these into account. And if you compare, say for example, unto this last, which is a very Christian phrase, right, from Bible, and put it with Sarvodaya, which is very non-Christian, right? It sounds very Hindu. Then you can see that this translation is almost like religious conversion as well, where something which is so deeply steeped in Bible and biblical philosophy combined with Ruskin's own Christian socialism becomes something else entirely. Now, if you say this is a bad translation or a good translation, it does not help us to understand the importance of translation. And that is the point I am trying to make. You don't understand the importance of Sarvodaya if you are interested in questions like what is lost in translation, what kind of What quality was the translation about? Or is Sarvodaya inferior to unto this last as a translation? Then you can see how narrow our thinking about translation would be. The contemporary translation studies, however, preoccupies itself with larger questions like relationship between translation and society. What is the impact of translation on society, and how does society affect activity of translation? What is the role of translation in literary and cultural history of a particular place or a society? How does dominant ideological outlook of the society and translator affect translation activity? How does translation affect ideological currents in society? How does and contemporary translation studies often focuses on the role and the function of translation in target language and culture, and the role of target language and culture in the process of translation. It is very often descriptive in approach. So if you just compare it with the traditional view of translation, then you will see that there is a shift after 1978 about thinking about translation, right? And what is this shift? We are no longer interested in just comparing merits or demerits of verbal equivalences, right? That is very old-fashioned way of doing translation. We are interested in larger questions, like what role did James by translation of Bible play in the history of English society and culture? That is more important question than saying how King James version of Bible is a good translation or a bad translation, right? You can see how this good bad way of looking at translation is a very narrow and restrictive way, which does not help us to understand the impact, importance of translation. Like the book, like Sarvodaya, right? So is Sarvodaya a good translation? Is almost an irrelevant question, right? So this evaluative way of looking at translation is something that is replaced by a more descriptive approach, right? And the second shift that has happened is focus in the conventional thinking about translation was from the point of view of source text, right? So the source text, source language would always be seen as having certain merit which is being taken away in translation, right? So when you are looking at Hindi translation of Kabir into English, there, right? And you know Hindi language, the Khadi Boli of Kabir, and then you will always find that, oh, this is missing, this is bad, this is not adequate. You will always find translation as inadequate when you look at it from the source language, source culture point of view. And what happens because of that is that you forget that translation is not made for people who know the source language. If you already know Gujarati, then what is the point? So the English translation of Narsi Mehta is not meant for people who know Gujarati. It is meant for people who don't know Gujarati. So we forget this very basic fact. So contemporary translation studies often focuses on the function and the role of translation in target language and culture, which means what does Sarvodaya do in Indian context, right? And we can see that it almost triggers or it lays a kind of philosophical, ideological foundation of Gandhian freedom struggle, right? Nothing less than that, which consequently results in freedom of India, right? So you can see that translation has played a foundational role in freedom struggle, which resulted in the great political transformation of India. So this kind of power and importance of translation can be overlooked if I am just asking whether Sarvodaya is a good translation or a bad translation, right? So I am looking now at Sarvodaya as what does it do to Indian society? What does it do to Gujarati society? What does it do? When I ask what does it do, it means I'm asking the question about its function and the role in Gujarati, which is the target language in culture. So the focus has shifted from source language orientation to target language with the rise of contemporary translation studies. At the same time, I am asking, why does a particular book gets translated, right? Why does Unto This Last get translated? Why did Gandhi select that book, right? Or why did people translate Savarkar's Marathi book into English at all? If I ask this question, then the reasons behind translation are deeply driven by ideological currents of the time, right? And you can see that the soldiers of Indian National Army, led by Subhash Chandra Bose and as well as Ghadar Party in America, these people made Savarkar's book in English translation a kind of necessary reading for all freedom fighters. So you can see how ideological currents determine the choice and selection of the text, as well as how the text is translated. So contemporary translation studies now focuses on these questions instead of asking whether translation is good or bad, whether equivalence is correct, or what is lost in translation. All these questions become irrelevant when we ask more important questions to translation. So these are some of the important contemporary translation studies, and one of the very significant development is the one that I mentioned about Gideon Terry. Something called Rewriting or Manipulation School of Translation Studies, associated with André Lefebvre and Theo Hermans, and Polysystem approach associated with Itamar Ibn Zohar. And these translation students or researchers look at the politics of translation, right? What role does translation play in service of certain ideological agendas? Or as Itamar Ibn Zohar says, that translations can be interventions in debates, right? Instead of seeing translation as good, bad, or adequate, inadequate, you are now looking at how translations intervene in the development of culture or history of culture. Then many contemporary approaches like post-colonial approach and cultural studies approach translation sees as ideological activities involving politics of representations, which can be understood in its social, cultural, historical context. It also seeks to critically rethink the histories of culture by highlighting asymmetrical relation between languages and culture. And one of the most well-known example is Edward Said's Orientalism, right? And the argument in Orientalism, I think many of you may be aware of, you may have studied it as part of your coursework or your MA, is that the representations of the Orient, that is East, were done with a certain political agenda that was connected to the colonial project. For example, translations would be largely from Sanskrit texts into English by Orientalist scholars, right? And the agenda was clear that they wanted to show how great India was in the time of Vedic culture or Mahabharata, Ramayana or Kalidas. And they want to point out that now India is not such great, which justifies their own project of colonialism. We have come to rescue you and we are also brothers. So you can see how ideological politics affects the way texts are translated and also the reason or rationale behind translations of that text. A very famous example is by Umar Khayyam's very famous Rubaiyat, were translated by Edward Fitzgerald in 19th century. And Umar Khayyam's poems were strategically transformed into something else, right? And Edward Fitzgerald tried to fit this into Victorian poetics of the time to suit Victorian audience, their taste, their preferences. And he also converted certain things like Saki and Maikhana images, right? So Saki is a boy who serves liquor to men. And very often poetry is addressed, love poems addressed to Saki have this homoerotic, homosexual connotations, which were completely erased in Victorian translation. And Edward Fitzgerald would say that the live crow is better than the stuffed eagle. And because Omar Khayyam is from Orient, he can take as much liberties as possible. And he says that I will improve Omar Khayyam because it's backward. So this kind of attitudes to translation are shaped by the political, ideological currents of the time. And these are the questions that we very often try to understand in post-colonial translation. What is common to all these contemporary approaches is the rejection of the idea that translation is secondary, inadequate, or inferior version of the original. And the assumption that translation can only be understood in its cultural, historical context. These are the two important core assumptions of contemporary translation studies, which means translation is seen as a discourse, right, as well. Let us now take a look at André Lefebvre's theorization of translation, because for me, in some way, it's a phase shift kind of theoretical reformulation of entire discipline of translation that André Lefebvre and others tried to bring about. What he has done is that he has tried to understand the place of translation in Western literary studies. And he argues that translation was seen as a very marginal or secondary activity. And this was largely due to influence of romantic notions of originality, genius, and also to Platonic and Christian view of translation as derivative. Sometimes 4 times removed from reality in Plato's scheme of things. If art is 3 times removed, translation would be 4 times removed from reality. Or secondary activity, as against the sanctity of the original text, like Bible. So Christian philosophers looked at translation with great deal of suspicion, because they thought that this was in some way betrayal of the original author. And during the Reformation period, translation, when it was transferred to the vernacular, when Bibles started moving towards vernacular, it brought about a shift in Christianity with the rise of Protestantism, right? We are aware of that as scholars of English literary history. It was also Eurocentric and nationalist in its orientation. So in order to overcome this marginality of translations, he said we should make 3 fundamental distinctions while researching translation. So he goes on, Lefebvre goes on to give 3 distinctions, which is very important. The first distinction is between translation and translating, which means, suppose now if you are planning to work on writing a research paper in translation, or if you are planning to write MPhil or PhD thesis on translation, you have to take a position on these 3 distinctions, right? You have to decide what you are going to do on the basis of 3 distinctions. So it's a kind of map that Lefebvre is giving if you want to study research translation, right? It's not necessary that you're doing MPhil, PhD. You may be writing a research paper. So the first distinction is between the text, translated text. Are you going to study translated text, like Unto This Last or War of Indian Independence, or you are going to study the activity of translating, the process, the choices, various decisions that translator has made in selection of words, equivalence, and so on and so forth, right? So distinction between product and process is the first key distinction. So if you want to write a paper on translation, then you have to first decide what are you going to look at. Are you going to look at the product, or are you going to study the process? The second distinction is between normative and evaluative approach to translation. Are you going to take, are you going to judge whether Gandhi's translation is good translation, or whether the English translation of Marathi book by Savarkar is a good translation? Or are you going to take descriptive approach to translation, where you are not going to evaluate, you are not going to pass judgment? So that is the second distinction. The third distinction is between the analysis of translation or producing translations yourself, right? So are you going to translate it yourself? And these are the kind of theses that you often receive, like the one that I did, right? I translated Narsi Mehta into English. So instead of analyzing already existing translation, what I did was that I produced translation myself. So you have to make these choices before you are going to translate, before you are going to study translation, right? So traditional study of translation was largely practice centric. That means you are trying to figure out how Gandhi chose equivalents, or what were the strategies used by Gandhi. That is practice centric approach. And this traditional way is also evaluative, that you judge, अरे ये word अच्छा नहीं है, उससे बेहतर तो वो word use करना, right? So that kind of evaluative study of translation. While the contemporary, the way we do it, is product centric and descriptive. That means we are not interested in whether Gandhi's translation is good or bad, right? Adequate or inadequate. We are interested in what does it do? How does it work? Then Lefebvre goes on to give a very important theoretical tool to study translation, and that for me is very important for the development of world literature notion that we are going to look at. He says that if translation has to go back to, if the translation has to be given its due in study of literature in the world, we have to see translation as part of larger process called refraction. What happens in refraction is that work is adapted to a different audience, right? With the intention of influencing the ways in which audience reads the text. And this is everywhere in our culture. For example, none of you may have read real Valmiki Ramayana, for example, in Sanskrit, or not many of you may have read Mahabharata in original, but you have seen TV series, you have seen comics, you have seen films, you have read smaller books, you have heard it from your parents, stories, right? So this way a Sanskrit text reaches you, right? And all of it is done with certain intention to influence you, according to Lefebvre. And this process, these various kinds of activities are called refraction. So refraction is a larger category, right, in which texts from one culture are used, or texts from one language are used in another culture or in another language, right? So it may be, you may not have read all the novels of Harry Potter, but you may have seen the films, right? And you know the storyline, and you know what happens in the Harry Potter world by watching films. Now this is refraction. So what does Lefebvre suggest is that we should not see translation as a kind of verbal activity of finding equivalents, but we should see it as part of larger processes of refraction. And I'm familiar with some of the students who could never learn, never read Shakespeare's book in their syllabus in original. They would read guidebooks in Gujarati very often. Now, these Gujarati guidebooks were the refractions, right? They were meant for certain kind of audience, and they had certain different purpose. And this purpose was to help students pass examination. So refractions are various kinds of practices and texts in which text from one language is taken to another language, right? So inside of this broad umbrella category of refraction, Lefebvre suggests this is how we should study translation. Translation should be seen as a part of the processes of refraction. And he goes on to say even critical commentary, even critical note written, say for example on Baudelaire or say T.S. Eliot in Gujarati by people like Suresh Joshi, right, would be seen as one of the ways through which text is refracted, right, made available to different audience with a view of influencing them, right. So if you look at Sarvodaya, then it should be seen not as verbal equivalents, but as refraction of Ruskin in Gujarati context. It is an adaptation of Ruskin's work to Indian audience with the intention of influencing the way in which the audience understands Ruskin, right? Or if you look at how Marathi book is translated into English, you have to see it as part of refraction. It was made a part of textbooks that freedom fighters would have to study if they are fighting for India using violent means, right? As against Gandhi, who emphasized non-violence. So this brings us to the next idea of world literature, and world literature has been redefined. Just like there is a shift in the way we understand translation, there is a shift in the way we understand world literature. Just like there is a shift from the conventional understanding of translation to modern understanding of translation as refraction, there is a shift from understanding world literature conventionally to more contemporary ways. So traditional meaning of world literature was as if it was a kind of qualitative one or a canon, masterpieces of literatures in all languages of the world, right? So that is how Goethe or Marx would see it, that the best books from India and best books from Africa and the best books from Europe, you put them together in a library, and that library would be called world literature. That was the conventional understanding, traditional understanding of world literature. After 1990, people like David Damrosch and Pascal Casanova recast the meaning of world literature. And David Damrosch goes on to say that world literature encompasses all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. Work only has an effective life as world literature whenever it is actively present within literary system beyond that of its original culture. And David Damrosch goes on to argue that world literature is not an infinite, ungraspable canon of works, but rather a mode of circulation and reading, a mode that is applicable to individual works as to bodies of material available for reading established classics and new discoveries alike. So what has shifted here? What is it that has shifted? That we don't see world literature as series of great books, Shakespeare, Homer, Valmiki, Vyas, right? What we see world literature as is the ways texts circulate beyond their language, where they originated, in other language and influence it. So Ghalib is world literature in Gujarati, because from Urdu and Persian he brought his genre was adapted to Gujarati, right? It was refracted into Gujarati, giving rise to Gujarati ghazal. Kabir, writing in Sadhukadi, but has a major presence in Gujarati literary traditions and in Marathi as well, because there is something like Kabir Panth, and there is a lot of material that is deeply influenced by Kabir in Gujarati, right? So Kabir can be understood as world literature, Ghalib can be understood as world literature, because these works circulate beyond the language of their origins. So what is world literature? World literature is not objects, but a mode of circulation, the way of circulation and of reading. So that is something that is very important to us. There is something like Dionys Durizin and interliterary model of world literature, which I'm actually planning to skip, given the I'm more interested in having a discussion later. So I'm going to skip this part. But maybe if you ask me, then I can talk about it in question answer session. This is about digital humanities and world literature. And this is one more new idea of world literature that is being promoted by a very well-known scholar called Franco Moretti. And in 1990, I think it was a scholar named Pascal Casanova in French, who said that literature has now become a planetary system. That means it has become a space. It is, and that space is deeply driven by global politics, right? But at the same time, having certain kind of autonomy. So it's a kind of nearly autonomous space that is global, that has emerged with globalization and colonialism and capitalism. Then Franco Moretti says that world literature is now building upon Casanova, that it is a planetary system and it has a core and periphery. In the sense that the European literature, American literature would be considered as core, and rest of it would be at the periphery. What is interesting for us is then how does Moretti approach the question of world literature? He says that world literature is not an object but a problem, and the question of methodology is the most important one. He says that if you want to read millions of books, how are you going to do it? Because world literature as a planetary system is massive, made of millions of texts. Google Books is I think contains millions of books. How are you going to study it? And he tries to bring about a shift in the way we study literature. So the first shift that we saw was from thinking translation in traditional terms to contemporary. The second one was understanding world literature in traditional terms and a new way of thinking about world literature. Franco Moretti advances a new way of reading literature in first place. And all of us are aware of something called close reading, right? Where we read very carefully 3 or 5 novels for our Ph.D, right? And then go on to talk about the cultural history, cultural background. Say you read 3 novels by Jane Austen carefully, close reading, and then say what was the society like in early 19th century. Moretti would say that in Jane Austen's time, there were thousands of novels which were written. Thousands, right? And in order to reach a conclusion that what does Jane Austen tell you about 19th century, we have to read fairly huge sample size, at least 50 novels you will have to read, and you can see that it's not possible for anybody to read that much for PhD projects, right? 50 novels. So you are dealing with a very small sample size and making generalizations, and this is where we are talking of research methods, right? We are talking of today going to be talking of research methods. So the sample size to draw conclusions has to be substantial. And so close reading, in its all incarnation from new criticism to deconstruction, is canonical. And he says at bottom it's a theological exercise, very solemn treatments of few texts taken very seriously. So in order to deal with global system, the great unread of almost infinite archive of world literature text, he says we need a newer method for studying literature, and the one that relies on other people's research without single direct textual reading. One which uses computing technology to read massive data sets, the big data sets, using computers. And this method he calls distinct reading. So distinct reading is one of the methodological shift that he wants to bring about from close reading to distant reading. And that is in the context of digital humanities, because that distant reading is possible only by using computers, where you use millions of novels and using a computer program that you write, right? Where you produce information that is represented in form of graphs, charts, or things like that. So let us, I want to end this with David Damrosch's discussion on translation and world literature. And David Damrosch goes on to define world literature in three ways. The first is it's an elliptical refraction of national literatures. Secondly, world literature is writing that gains in translation. I think you need to think a bit about it. Third is world literature is not a set of canon, but a mode of reading, a form of detached engagement with worlds beyond our place. And recently he goes on to give two perspectives on world literature. That is that on one hand, you move world literature as vast landscape, right? And you move away from Eurocentrism and emphasize that world literature is always experienced within national context. What do we mean by all these things? Now let us go back to the examples that we started out with. And most of the readers of Gandhi would be Gujarati readers who would not be reading Ruskin. So they are reading refraction of Ruskin, right? Secondly, world literature is writing that gains in translation. So the whole idea of Sarvodaya, right, which is Gandhi's coinage, is something that has gained from translation. So while you lose something in translation, you gain something. And what do you gain when you translate? You gain world literature. So what does it mean when he says world literature is always experienced within national context? He means that Ruskin exists for Gujarati readers only in Gandhi's translation, right? So it is within the national context that you see world literature. You find Ruskin in Gujarati, right? Ruskin is not found in English, but Ruskin is found within Gujarati. And he reverses this figure ground trope to say that nation frames most of the experiences of world literature, and world literature also shapes the reading of nation. This is the explanation to what I was saying. what Damrosch highlights is the recipient culture, that is Gujarati, is the primary context of translation. And the study of translation reveals social and cultural history of national culture. Now you can connect it with the contemporary translation studies, which says the recipient culture is more important. What is the ideological agenda behind translation? What is the function of translation in recipient text, recipient culture? So contemporary translation studies and world literature are almost sharing their protocols. It's almost a shared overlap domain. So as if they are saying they are taking similar view of both things. So what is translation studies called today would be called world literature, right? So what is the new name of translation studies? You can say world literature is the new name of translation studies. So that extent that it has absorbed some of the key assumptions of translation studies. So that is the argument that I was making. And Emily Apter has critiqued world literature because of her emphasis that whole idea of world literature is based on a translatability assumption, and consequently the incommensurability, that means things which cannot cross over to other cultures, are untranslatable, are insufficiently built into your literary theory and method. So this kind of tendency in world literature today is to as if endorsement of cultural equivalence, right? As if Gandhi's text and Ruskin's text are equivalent. This kind of belief that world literature markets is extremely problematic one. So her critique of world literature is based on the assumption that world literature is nothing but translation itself. And world literature, according to her, overlooks the untranslatable aspects of languages and culture. In short, the difference. That is her complaint. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. And these are some of the ideas that I have presented. I don't know how much time I have, and I will be happy to have a conversation about difficulties and issues, or if you have something to add to whatever is being said.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sachin. It was very interesting. A good connect that translation studies itself is a world literature. And like Emily Apter also problematizes that how you look at that idea also. There are a few questions in the chat. If you can read the chat, then you can pick up the questions and you can try to answer those questions.
Okay. So Komal asked, how can we make a difference between the adaptation and translation? It is difference based on strategies. It is strategic difference. How do you go about? So what are the choices that you are going to make in an adaptation, right? Are you going to retain certain things which do not exist in another language, right? So it's the all question of what are the strategies of equivalences, decisions that you make while translating. So it is a process level difference that we can make. So I hope I'm able to clarify something.
Yeah,
even choice of media, right?
Yeah, before you go to another question, like adaptations also, cinema, film adaptations, or adapting for a web series or television screen. Also, people see that from a book to a screen, it is translated there. So how do you view this also as a form of world literature, or how do you look at this also as a process?
Yeah. So once we go beyond the idea that text is something that is written or printed, right? Text can be visual as well. Okay? If you take a semiotic understanding of text, then everything is a text, right? So film is also a text, and a printed book is also a text. So going from printed book to cinema or TV series is a process of intermedial translation or intersemiotic translation, as Roman Jakobson has famously put it, right? And I would also see it as part of refraction, in the sense that it is rewritten with a certain agenda in mind. And very obvious example will be Hyder, Hamlet's Hyder, right? Where you can see the end is very different along with certain things. So why do you think the whole setting of the play is transformed? Is the ideological reason behind making that film, right? So while we study adaptations as refractions, we are also interested what are their agendas, what are their constraints, what are the and to use Gulzar's very famous phrase, right, that I am Shakespeare ke kandhe pe se goli chala. That's what he says, right? So he is shooting something from Shakespeare's shoulders, to put literally. So you can see the agendas here. And when you start looking at translation as refraction, you are able to uncover these constraints and agendas very clearly. That's how I see it. And I think Prakruti's question is connected to that, right? About digital platforms, right? So once you get rid of text as a printed object and start looking at it as a semiotic one, then I think all these questions would find their own answers. Okay, Samia says world literature is something which can go beyond the language of origin, its refraction. Does it mean as many as it has having translation? Yes. World literature is not something that goes in another language. It's the other way around. Something that goes into other languages called world literature. I hope I'm clear, right? It is not something which is taken into, this is world literature and that's why it goes into another language. No. What I'm saying is, what Damrosch is saying is, just because certain texts enter another language, they become world literature because they are an active, they influence that language very deeply, right? So if you find Kabir Ghalib Tagore, for example, or Sarat Chandra, right? And people used to think that Sarat Chandra is a Gujarati novelist, right? And that happened because Sarat Chandra is such a major influence in Gujarati that we forget that he is a Bengali author. So his Bengali texts have become active part of Marathi and Gujarati literary histories, and thus Sarat Chandra is understood as world literature. And you can see translation is the key process through which this kind of world literature circulates. That is the mechanism.
Okay, one more point in this. So it's a very interesting point that a text which is translatable, or the text which is inviting the translators from the other languages can be considered as world literature. So in a different way, if any particular text fails to find a translator or an urge for the other readers to read that, then that won't be a world literature.
Yes.
Doesn't it damage any particular text being
maybe it does, but then it goes against the canonical idea of world literature, right? So maybe some texts are considered great in their language, but nobody in Gujarati feels like reading them, right? So in the context of Gujarati literature, it is not world literature, right? So world literature has to be understood within national context. I hope I'm
yeah, it's fine. Yeah, the other point, like in India, we have many languages. So changing from one Indian to another Indian language, but still that national urge or that canon of nationality remains. How does it turn into a world if it is still not translated into any of the global languages?
Very good. I think this is one of the most, I think that is one of the strengths of the new definition of world literature, that Sarat Chandra was world literature before he was into English, right? Before his English translations arrived, he was there everywhere, in Malayalam, in Gujarati, in Marathi. or Visa Khandegar was translated into Gujarati first and English later, right? So it's not important that only if you go global you become world literature. Once you cross the boundaries of any language and culture, you become world literature. So this idea, new idea, or Ambrosius idea of world literature is able to, we are able to, what should I say, provincialize Europe. And that is what precisely I have tried to do in the book that I'm working on history of Marathi literature, where I have seen as the question that Vaidehi is asking just now, that classical text like Valmiki, now there are rewritings of Ramayana in Marathi and Gujarati, Mahabharata. So they are seen as world literature. Bhagavad Gita is world literature, right? Even if it did not reach Europe, because it's there in part of so many cultures in India. So story of Ram is world literature. So that is how you are able to open up Eurocentric canons by this new definition of world literature. So it's not just Shakespeare, but even who should I say? Gita is the most obvious example. Kabir, Ghalib, Manto, all these are examples of world literature. Now, Vaidehi is asking about correct translations from. Now, the problem is that correct translation is always an interpretation, right? And the translator always has certain arguments about whether what is correct and incorrect. Now, what is correct translation is always contested. Is Sarvodaya a correct translation of unto this last? Then you would say no, obviously, right? So the question that some translation is good, bad, right, wrong, accurate, inaccurate is not a very profitable one, fruitful one, because we don't understand the importance of translation. If you are looking for correct translation, it's a very narrow, restrictive question, and we have gone beyond that. Okay, there is one. If there are more than one translation of book and adaptation, how to choose the correct? As I said, and again, Lefebvre's essay that I mentioned, Mother Courage, talks about 3 or 4 translations of Mother Courage and her children. A very famous, and her cucumbers. I'm sorry, a very famous play by Brecht. It was translated several times. Now, instead of saying which one is better, Lefebvre argues that if you see it as refraction, then we are able to understand the cultural context of each 3 or 4 translations in a different way, right? For example, the later translations had cuss words and abuses, which were there in the original, which were removed by the earlier translator, right? So instead of saying which is the correct translation, we are trying to find out how does culture and ideology shape these multiple translations, right? What are the historical contexts of these? That is a better way of, that is contemporary way of studying translation. Pooja.
Yes, thank you, sir.
So when a writer himself or herself is translating the work, so how far, like one question is that, well, can that also be the parameter of world literature or included into that? One thing. And then how do we judge that translation when the writer themselves are doing in other languages?
Thank you. These are very important and very interesting questions. And the obvious example is Gitanjali by Tagore. And Tagore translated it. He cut his poems short. He mixed couple of poems and wrote English. So his own translation was extremely inaccurate, incorrect, right? However, it won him Nobel Prize. Right. So what happens here is that you become world literature even if you have this license to recreate, because you take creative liberties. ये मेरी poem है, मैं कुछ भी कर सकता हूँ, right? But the recent translation of Gitanjali by, say, for example, Radis has shown that how different the Bengali version is. Now, here Radis translation is more accurate. right? But it did not get the same fame as Tagore's own text, right? So what would we be looking for is not judging which is better, but what is the impact of translations, or what was the ideological, political, cultural history that was at the back of the translation. So why did Tagore do what he did, right? Is a question that is more interesting. And after it won the Nobel Prize, it was translated into all Indian language, right? So how does larger economic questions of patronage, of status, of manipulation of readers' name, and very quickly Tagore's fame declined, very quickly. It reached its pinnacle and it came down, and people started disliking Tagore. Ezra Pound is very famously person who first promoted Tagore in when then he started coming back saying, no, this is not what I like. This is not modernism that I am talking about. So you can see how market and plays a big role in translation. Nobel Prize मिल जाता है तो market मिल जाता है और translations आ जाते हैं. And then there are imitators.
No, fine, interesting. Anybody else? Any other questions? If anybody has, yeah.
So instead of judging which is good, we are asking these questions of market, patronage, politics, history, and how does Gitanjali become world literature?
Yes. So how people are taking, like, from like monetary concern to cultural concern, the acceptance in culture to the financial support, everything.
And political concerns means your circle, like Gandhi, like Savarkar's translators in India House.
Okay. Anybody else? If you have any questions. Okay, fine. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sachin. It was very interesting. Yeah.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me. And if you have more queries, you can write to me as well.
Yeah,
Professor
of course.
Maharaja would have his emails. I would love to respond to queries later as well.
Thanks a lot. It was a very good concept of reading world literature and translation also. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Bye. Yeah.